Geneticists running population surveys across Europe would pull a sample, a person from Romania, a person from Spain, a person from the Hungarian plains, and find a Y chromosome haplogroup that belonged, by every frequency map they had, to the Indian subcontinent. Not as a trace, not as background noise, as a dominant signal. The same signal, the same lineage, in populations separated by 1,000 miles of European geography. A surname written not on paper but inside the body itself, passed from father to son across 50 generations, and pointing unmistakably, stubbornly, to a caste system on the other side of the world. The people carrying it are the Roma, 12 million of them, living across Europe from Portugal to Russia, from Scotland to Turkey, Europe's largest ethnic minority. A people who have been called by a dozen different names, persecuted under all of them, and studied extensively. And yet, when the genomic data finally came back in the 21st century, it refused to cooperate with any of the clean explanations that had been prepared for it. The data pointed to India, and then it pointed somewhere else entirely. For generations, the accepted story was this: the Roma came from India. The evidence for that had been in plain sight since 1782, when a German scholar named Johann Rüdiger published a careful linguistic study noting that Romani, the language spoken by Roma communities across Europe, was not a Creole, not a cipher, not a fabricated argot. It was a genuine descendant of Sanskrit-derived languages spoken in northwestern India. The vocabulary matched, the grammar matched. Structural features of Romani corresponded closely to Punjabi and Kashmiri, the languages of the Punjab region. Later scholars, working through the 19th and early 20th centuries, confirmed and deepened those findings. The linguistic case became ironclad. History filled in around the language. Somewhere between the 5th and 10th centuries CE, a group left northwestern India. They were not warriors or conquerors. The evidence pointed toward artisans, blacksmiths, musicians, weavers, entertainers, service workers operating at the lower end of the Indian caste hierarchy. They crossed Persia. They moved through Armenia and Anatolia. By approximately 1050 CE, they appear in Byzantine records, a people passing through the Balkans, already speaking a language no Greek scholar recognized, already practicing trades that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the empire's edges. From the Balkans, they spread west, into Hungary, into Romania, into France, Germany, Spain, the British Isles. They carried fragments of Indian culture with them, endogamous marriage patterns, clan hierarchies that echoed the caste structures they had left behind, musical forms that bore faint resemblances to North Indian folk traditions. The story was coherent, poignant. A people displaced, crossing half the world, rebuilding their identity in motion. It was a satisfying story, the kind of story that holds a people together across centuries. Then the DNA labs opened their results files. And here is where it gets complicated. The anomaly is not subtle. When researchers began studying Roma genetics in detail, they looked at two separate biological clocks: the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son and carries the paternal lineage, and mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and carries the maternal lineage. Think of the Y chromosome as a surname recorded in flesh, the father's line, written into every cell of every male descendant. Think of mitochondrial DNA as the mother's archive, older, more diverse, passed intact through the female line. The two archives told different stories. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal signal, pointed to northwestern India. Haplogroups M501, M18, and M35B. Lineages found at meaningful frequencies in Punjab, consistent with the linguistic evidence, consistent with the accepted story. The Y chromosome told a different story entirely. The dominant paternal haplogroup in Roma men across Europe is H1A1A-M82. In a 2012 study published in PLOS One, researchers analyzed more than 10,000 global samples to trace where this haplogroup was most concentrated. The answer was not northwestern India. The haplogroup reached its highest frequencies, 8, sometimes exceeding 20% of all male lineages, 8, in southern Indian populations, particularly among scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Deccan Plateau region. Northwestern India, where the linguistic origin story pointed, showed much lower frequencies of the same marker. Father's line, southern India. Mother's line, northwestern India. Two signals, 1,500 kilometers apart. Clean, incompatible. And then the genome-wide data complicated everything further. In 2013, a team led by researchers at Harvard Medical School's Reich Lab published a study in PLOS One analyzing hundreds of thousands of genetic markers from 6 Roma groups across 4 European countries. Their finding was stark. Roma today carry approximately 80% West Eurasian ancestry, meaning 4 out of every 5 units of their genome now reads as European or Middle Eastern. Only about 20% of their DNA still registers as South Asian. That 20%, however, is molecularly unmistakable. It cannot be misread. It cannot be attributed to noise. It is the locked, compressed, indelible signature of a founding population that was itself already genetically unusual before it ever left India. A 2020 study by researchers at the Institut Pasteur in Paris and multiple European institutions, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, found that the Proto-Roma underwent a 44% reduction in effective population size before their diaspora even began. Nearly half their genetic diversity was already gone before the first foot crossed the border. Not by years, by centuries. The first theory says the contradiction is explainable. The Proto-Roma were not a homogeneous group from one corner of northwestern India. They were an occupationally defined mixed caste community that had already absorbed South Indian male lineages through generations of labor migration across the subcontinent. The Indian caste system moved skilled workers across vast distances. Blacksmiths, metalworkers, and entertainers followed patrons and trade routes in ways that cut across regional boundaries. Under this model, the South Indian Y chromosome signal in Roma men reflects not the origin of the Roma as a people, but the prior mobility of the male workers who eventually became part of the Proto-Roma founding group. The maternal lineage, anchored in Punjab, represents the women who stayed in one place while the men moved. The language, rooted in northwestern India, reflects the geographic center of gravity of the group before departure. This theory is tidy. It does real explanatory work, but it has a problem. If the male founders were simply scattered laborers drawn from across the Indian subcontinent, you would expect paternal genetic diversity, multiple Y chromosome haplogroups representing multiple regional origins. Instead, what researchers find across all Roma populations in Europe, from the Iberian Roma in Spain to the Roma of Lithuania and Hungary, is a single dominant paternal lineage. One signal, uniform. As if all the male founders, wherever they came from originally, passed through a bottleneck so tight that only one lineage survived to be inherited by every Roma man alive today. The second theory is more complicated and more unsettling. It says the Roma were not an accidental or gradual gathering of displaced workers. They were a single, coherent founding group that left India together, at roughly the same time, under pressure. The genetic uniformity is the signature not of diversity absorbed over centuries, but of a population collapse so severe that it wiped out all but one paternal line. The 2020 Institut Pasteur study supports this. The Proto-Roma split from the Punjabi population less than 2,000 years ago, and were already genetically isolated from mainstream Punjabi populations before the diaspora began. This was not a people who drifted apart from India gradually. This was a people who were separated sharply, and who arrived in Europe already genetically compressed. The proposed historical triggers are several. Some researchers point to the Ghaznavid invasions of the Indian subcontinent between 1001 and 1027 CE, military campaigns that shattered lower caste communities in the northwestern regions, forcing displacement at a scale that could account for a mass departure. Others point to earlier political upheavals in the 6th to 9th centuries CE, when shifting Indian kingdoms reorganized the labor hierarchies that service castes depended on for survival. The limitation of Theory 2 is that it collides with complete historical silence. There are no contemporary Indian records of a mass departure. None. If tens of thousands of people left, if an entire occupational community was uprooted and sent west, someone in India should have written it down. The absence is itself a data point, and it is one that Theory 2 cannot explain away. The origin was erased at the source. Researchers are careful to frame this as a possibility, not a certainty. The silence could mean the departure was too gradual, or too low status, to attract documentation. But it is a silence that sits uneasily alongside the genetic evidence. The third, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, suggests that what we call the Roma founding population was never a community in any culturally meaningful sense. Not at first. The sex-biased asymmetry in Roma genetics, the concentrated single paternal lineage combined with more diverse maternal lineages, is exactly what researchers expect to find when a population was assembled under coercion rather than choice. A 2020 study published in Scientific Reports by a team at Barcelona's CEIC-IMAS Institute found that the Roma maternal genetic pool carries higher lineage diversity from South Asia than the paternal pool, while the paternal pool is dominated by a single South Asian male lineage, so uniform that it points to a handful of founding fathers, possibly fewer. The data doesn't confirm a specific mechanism. It only fails to rule out this one, that somewhere between the Indus and the Euphrates, probably in Persia, probably in the 9th or 10th century CE, a small group of South Indian men, possibly enslaved, possibly conscripted, possibly captured in the chaos of one of the era's many military campaigns, came into sustained contact with a group of Northwest Indian women who were similarly displaced. And from that contact, whatever its circumstances, a people began. If this is true, the Roma identity was not inherited. It was invented. Built from nothing, in motion, under pressure, by people who did not share a language when they found each other, and who would not share one for years. Imagine standing in a mountain pass in the Zagros range in what is now western Iran in roughly the year 900 CE. It is autumn. The stone is cold under your hands. The air is thin and dry, and it smells of cook fires and animal hide and the particular mineral sharpness of high-altitude dust. Around the fire, a single fire, not a city, not a camp, but one fire, there are perhaps 200 or 300 people. This is not an army. This is not a merchant caravan. This is a group small enough that you can count the children. Small enough that when the man next to you coughs, you hear it clearly across the space. Someone near the fire is playing an instrument. It has a drone string, a string that hums beneath the melody without changing pitch, and the sound it makes is something you might almost recognize. Almost like the classical music of the Punjab. Almost. But the melody is bending in ways you did not expect, absorbing something from the musical language of the plateau, the Persian quarter tones bleeding in at the edges. This is the moment the music begins to change. Every Roma person alive today, in a Hungarian village, a Spanish flamenco hall, a Welsh caravan, a Romanian city, descends from the people around that fire. The math is that simple. The number was that small. The mystery is why so few of them were enough. This is the part the records don't explain. How a population that small survived what came next. In 2022, a study published in Scientific Reports analyzed the complete mitochondrial DNA sequences of 144 Iberian Roma individuals and found that over 60% of their maternal genetic pool consisted of founder lineages, South Asian and Middle Eastern in origin, that predated the recorded arrival of Roma in Spain. The Roma had been in Iberia since approximately the 15th century CE. Their DNA carried an archive that was centuries older than their arrival. Meanwhile, the non-Roma Iberian population showed only about 0.7% autochthonous founder lineages. The Roma were, by this measure, more genetically coherent than the Spanish populations that had spent 5 centuries trying to assimilate or expel them. The endogamy that European societies imposed on Roma communities, the forced separateness, the legal prohibitions on intermarriage, the social exclusion that made the Roma marry within their own group because the alternative was to not marry at all, turned out to be the very mechanism that preserved what Europe was trying to erase. The persecution became the seal on the archive. The walls they built around the Roma kept something inside that would otherwise have dissolved into Europe's genetic background within a handful of generations. And then there is the language. Romani was dismissed for centuries as a debased dialect, a made-up code, a language not worth serious study. Scholars who looked closely found something different. What Romani preserved in its grammatical structure, in vocabulary items that had vanished from the living languages of northwestern India, was a kind of phonological fossil, a record of how people spoke in the Punjab region approximately 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. The language that no longer exists in India was maintained intact, in the mouths of people that India had forgotten, in the forests and roads and margins of a continent that never wanted them. The name was rejected, the language was dismissed, the history was erased at the source. Adapted, the culture was called a threat. Adapted, the people were legally barred from full existence in every country they entered. Adapted, and across 50 generations, what emerged from all of that adaptation was a genome and a language so coherent, so legible, so resistant to dissolution, that 21st century scientists could read the whole journey in a single blood sample. An elder in a Roma community in Hungary, when asked by a researcher what she thought about the DNA findings, that her people came from India, that her blood carried a story older than any European state, reportedly said something simple. She already knew they came from somewhere far away. She had always been told. She just hadn't known how far the data would go to confirm it. The Roma story asks a question that no map has ever answered cleanly. What is an origin for a people who have no founding myth, no ancestral country that claims them, no written record of departure? The DNA gives a location, northwestern India, with a paternal shadow from the south. The DNA gives a date, less than 2,000 years ago. The DNA gives a bottleneck number. 44% of their diversity was already gone before they began. None of this constitutes an origin in the way that origin stories are usually told. There is no garden, no exodus, no prophet leading them out. There is only a compression event, a pass in the mountains, a fire that was small enough to count, and then centuries of motion. Every population that has ever been displaced carries a version of this in their genome. Most of those populations were numerous enough that the evidence blurred. The Roma were few enough that the evidence stayed sharp. Their genome is a palimpsest, layer written over layer, South Asian under Persian, under Balkan, under European, and every layer is still legible to anyone willing to read it. The writing was never fully overwritten, it was only buried. The DNA said they were not fully Indian. Europe said they were not European. And yet here they are, 10 million people, on a continent that spent 1,000 years trying to make them invisible, carrying a genome that remembers everything. The mystery was never where they came from. The mystery is how the world spent 1,000 years looking at that genome and chose, every time, not to see what was written there.